I'm feeling super flowy, so I think I'm going to go back to talking about my own interpretation of flow as possibly an equivalent to the experience of mania. Now, before you jump to conclusions about what I just said, I have a lot of explaining to do. And it's not really a linear correlation, it's not exactly the same, but I feel like there's a lot of congruencies. And I was listening again to a talk by Stephen Kotler. I think I said that right this time. And everything he talks about when he's talking about flow, if I would replace the word mania, it's a similar experience to me. So Stephen Kotler's never been in an experience of mania. So he wouldn't necessarily have the same realization that it's a very similar state. And if it's not a similar state, it at least has a lot of similar underlying principles and properties. So he hasn't been in the manic state to know when he's listening to himself that he's talking about something. When he's talking about flow, he's really also talking about the experience of mania. He talks about how flow is a spectrum. He talks about how there's 5 neurotransmitters or neurochemicals that are part of the flow state that we make inside our brains and bodies. And he said sometimes we have partial flow states where some of the neurochemicals or neurotransmitters of flow, some of the 5 are present, but not all of them. So I'm thinking to myself that mania is somewhere on that spectrum. And it could even be an experience that is hyper flow, like even beyond the regular flow experience. Or it could be maybe having some of those neurotransmitters, but not all of them. And of course, there would have to be some kind of studies to actually confirm the neurobiology and neurophysiology and neuroelectricity of people that are in mania, but good luck finding them to study them, because when they're in that state of flow, they're just flowing with the universe and not really one to want to be subjects of study. And usually a person is treated after the fact, after the mania turns into something else, and a person is then intervened with in some way. And Stephen also talks about how his flow state that he experienced healed him of Lyme's disease that he was debilitated for for 3 years. And in my mind, if you think flow states heal, it's possible that manic states heal. And a lot of people that go into these states have maybe a history of trauma, or they went traveling, or they can't sleep, or some people maybe fasted. All these things can put a person into that manic state. And in my mind, if I'm going to keep with the theme that mania is equivalent to flow in a lot of ways, it's possible that the manic state is a healing state. In my experience, I had some trauma happen before I experienced mania, a couple of months before, and I was having a hard time with it. And then all of a sudden, my being went into a state of complete ecstasy and wonderment for over a month. And if I think about how I was basically struggling within my psyche, all of a sudden my psyche was blown apart, my ego disappeared, and I was just in a state of childlike wonder, play, creativity, flow for over a month. That could possibly have been a healing mechanism. That could possibly have been almost like I was in so much pain and suffering that my psyche went into that state in order to sort of overcompensate for the suffering I'd had for a number of months. And that's just a theory, but to me, I'm just comparing how his flow state healed him, And I think that there's some healing that happens in the manic state. And again, I'm not glorifying mania, but at the same time, there's a lot of positivity in it, and it usually doesn't end up positive in the end. People usually crash in some way, and there's a number of thoughts about why that might be so. For one, a person's not used to operating without one's ego, and in mania, a person's not operating from their regular consciousness, where they're stuck in the repetitive story that keeps them grounded in daily reality. And Jamie Wheel talks about this as, the inner critic and the sort of going towards pleasure and avoiding pain mechanism that we're usually operating in. And he talks about kind of stepping outside of that. And mania is definitely stepping outside of that. And so a person's not used to operating in that mode. At least we haven't operated that way since childhood. And another reason too is that the world is not structured based on the principles that one experiences in, say, a manic flow state. So eventually a person kind of bumps into incongruencies in reality enough to bring them kind of back. Now, also, a person's not practiced in actually experiencing this flow state of consciousness, which is a lack of personal ego for a lot of it. And actually, one of the things I thought of was there's a lot of it that's lack of personal ego. But the trouble is that when interacting with people that one actually already knows, one does have to kind of bring the ego back in to interact with those people, because that's how we have been interacting with those people our entire life, and that gets kind of garbled in with the flow state. So Stephen Kotler talks about surfing and how he went surfing, and that was his flow state. Well, he knew how to surf, so had he not been able to surf, he probably wouldn't have gotten up to surf, and he wouldn't have gotten into a flow state, and it would have had no healing effect. Now, a person that first goes into the manic consciousness, they've never experienced it. So it's like trying to ride a 100-foot wave on a surfboard when you've never done it before. It's going to be very difficult. And, another thing too is with the ego getting confused in with the flow situation, by interacting with, say family and friends that one already knows. That's like trying to ride the 100-foot wave while getting sprayed in the face with a fire hose. It's just really difficult and confusing. You're trying to even ride this wave, but yet there's this other stream of water hitting you in the face. So I feel that this manic consciousness actually takes practice to ride that wave and be in flow with that wave and not be sprayed in the face by a fire hose at the same time. And then even if somebody is in manic consciousness and they're kind of riding that 100-foot wave, if you don't know how to ride the wave, even if you get up on the wave, you're probably going to crash at the bottom. And that's sort of the equivalent to depression in a way. So a person, if they're in the flow state riding the wave on a surfboard, literally, but they get sprayed in the face with a hose, they're probably going to crash at the bottom of the wave. And even though they were in flow, they're going to have some kind of injury at the bottom. So those sort of disturbances in the manic consciousness flow state, which are like disturbances from society, which society is a disturbance. It's not designed for flow at all. And then we're sitting here thinking, how do I get into flow when society's not designed for flow at all? And they talk about transient hypofrontality in the flow state, well, the whole society is based on the prefrontal cortex and thinking and cognition and deciding and our own personal stories that we repeat in our head. And as soon as we get into that story making consciousness, we are thinking in terms of past, present, and future. And as soon as we're thinking in terms of past, present, and future, we're not in the moment. And if we're not in the moment, we're not going to be in flow. So to me, a lot of the thinking about flow is actually perhaps preventing flow, because it's thinking itself, it's cognition itself that is actually in the way of flow. And even all the scientific studies in the world about flow are still cognition about flow. And they talk about how the state of flow is actually to be in a pre-cognitive state, sort of before the thinking. And they think basically that we make decisions before we're consciously aware of the decision. But in the flow, there's nobody there to make a decision. The one that makes the decision is an ego thinking that it's making a decision, choosing between one abstraction and another. But the actual happening of the thing is not an abstraction. That would be like saying that, I could hold up my birth certificate and say, hey, I was born. This proves I was born, this piece of paper. But I'm sitting right here, which proves I was born. I'm here. I'm a physical human being. So, in a way, to say that we need thought, choosing between something, making a decision, like, do we need decision to move? Most of our movements are not a decision. If I'm speaking, I'm not actually thinking, I'm deciding to move my mouth in this way. It's just happening. And then we have this tiny little bit of our brain devoted to this supposed decision-making process, choosing between two thoughts. And we think that the choosing between the two thoughts is what actually makes something happen. But it's actually the thing happens first, and then the thoughts come and the choosing process after. And then we think that we actually chose something. And it's actually it's like an optical illusion. And it's probably one that we need, because if all of a sudden we think, oh, we don't have free will, then we would go a little bit batty. But the thing is that when we realize that we don't need free will or something there choosing to move 99.99% of our information and stuff happening is just happening beyond conscious choice. And we have this conscious choice that isn't even our own conscious choice. It's programmed into us through our education and our family, and it's passed down through generations, and the memes are passed down through generations. And then we think we're actually choosing something. But we're just choosing between one illusion and another. So if we're thinking about something like our past, and then we think, oh, that's bad, I don't want to think that, we choose something else, we're thinking about the past, which isn't happening now, so we're not actually in the present moment. So we're actually creating this time in our psyche which doesn't actually exist. And then we spend all this time kind of wondering about it and stuff, and then craving it not being there, and then doing things by thinking about them in order for them not to be there. But that same thinking is the same as the thinking that you don't want. So trying to do anything about any of it is actually just strengthening it. So if I'm even to think, I really want to have a flow experience, I need more flow, how am I going to get flow? The I, the ego, is the barrier to flow. So the I, ego, trying to seek flow is actually avoiding flow by seeking it. So it's really messed up, actually. But once you actually see how it works, if you really consider how that whole mechanism works, and once you see how it works, you just kind of just watch it in a detached way. And Jamie Wheel talked about, instead of having our awareness taken up by that sort of story mechanism of past, present, future, about our own little history and problems and pleasure seeking and desire, it's sort of a switchboard monitoring our whole organism, or a dashboard, he said. And he didn't elaborate on that in the talk that I was watching, but in a way, it would be like, oh, like just being aware of my posture, being aware of my thoughts, but not trying to think my way out of the thoughts, or think different thoughts, or choose different thoughts. And what they're talking about too, and I don't know if they've studied J. Krishnamurti, but it's a lot of the same sort of thing in a way. Krishnamurti talks a lot about thought itself as the problem, not thinking better thoughts, not trying to become better psychologically, because all the psychological thoughts are just the same. So if I think a thought, he says the thinker is the thought. And it took me a long time to really grasp that, even though my thinking process has changed over the years to one of linear association of past, present, future, my own personal story, to, I would say, thoughts that arise that are more to do with the perception in the moment, or, something I need to do. Something I need to do isn't mixed in with, oh, this happened yesterday, and I am this and I am that, and oh, I forgot my keys. It's silent, 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 nothing, nothing, nothing. Oh, I forgot my keys. So it still happens. That's the thing. It doesn't need to be going on all the time. All this stuff in the prefrontal cortex in order for the brain to work efficiently. Something else happens, and it's similar, but it's still very different. And they talk about in flow, the prefrontal cortex actually pretty much shuts down. And they said they were surprised by this, because we think that more brain activity actually equates to more potential, or more human potential, and they're finding, oh, it actually shuts off. And that's the part where there's the inner critic and all these things. That inner critic is actually in the way of flow. And the prefrontal cortex is kind of everything we've gotten from society, all the programming, all the conditioning, all the inner critic stuff. And it has nothing to do with the exact moment now. So it's kind of an avoidance strategy. And I talked in another video about, recently I've made the correlation between mania and learning. And I really think this inner critic, circular thinking about not much of anything, actually blocks learning. How can we learn when that stuff is going on? We're not really learning anything. And society thinks learning is actually memorizing stuff. That's not learning at all. And the more we memorize, it actually kind of clogs up our brain. And we're actually designed to learn through play. And I feel that mania is synonymous with play and creativity and flow and energy. And I think this thinking process that we call like cognition is actually zapping our energy. And I had this thought too, because in their research that they're doing for the Flow Genome Project, they're kind of interested in things that help bring someone into flow in terms of physical stuff. So they talk about multiple G's of gravity and something about spinning people around and something else. And I'm just wondering if I have a curiosity about something to do with one's own personal center of gravity. So they talk about the extreme elite adventure sport athletes and how they're able to get in flow. And they've used that idea as a way to hopefully get other people into flow by making it safe for them to get their body into those extreme experiences. And it's interesting because these people who are the extreme adventure sport athletes, their body is kind of like one with gravity in a way, meaning that their center of gravity is sort of in line with the universe's gravity. So if somebody is jumping out of a plane or surfing, they have to know exactly how to rotate their body and move about their own center of gravity in order to do that. So they've become masters of their own center of gravity. And this is just my own thought. And when we think about it, the people who are in those moments, they're not going to be thinking about what's for dinner tomorrow when they're riding a 100-foot wave, and that's the whole ego goes away and they feel flow. So they go about putting their body in those extreme situations in order to get into flow. That takes a lot of training in order to learn how to ride a 100-foot wave in order to do that. And their body, the wave is actually mapped in their body, the gravity of all the waves that they've ridden, and their body is actually perfectly adapted to that activity, which then gives them the flow experience. Now, do we all have to be able to ride 100-foot waves in order to get our egos to shut up? I don't think so. And it's interesting because I actually feel that probably each person in a way has like a unique center of gravity. Everybody's would be a little bit different. How they carry themselves, how they walk, how they talk, their body shape, their muscle capacity, their body composition. So everybody's is a little bit different. And now a child kind of has a naturally perfect center of gravity as they're growing, but then as we go about life and we're contorted by the rules of society, by sitting in a desk for 6 hours a day for 20 years or more, and all these different things that are against the nature of the center of gravity of human beings. So if a person developed naturally, whatever that means, we probably don't even know what that means because society doesn't allow for that. I could imagine their center of gravity would be, they would carry themselves in their own unique, perfect way that was perfectly designed for how they were born. And they would be in their flow if they developed naturally. I feel like we're born in flow. We're not born with egos thinking about what happened last week. That is a societal thing. So for me too, all this hoopla is like, well, why don't we question why we train kids out of flow in the first place? Like, it's like, why do we do that? And I think mania is one of those compensation mechanisms. It's like an elastic band. You know, we're held down from our natural progression of our center of gravity throughout life, and then all of a sudden something releases and we spring into this manic consciousness, not because it's some kind of mental illness, it's actually our natural state. And it just feels weird, and it's hard to navigate, and it's hard to operate because we were conditioned out of being that way. But I think with practice we can actually learn how to master that energy. We're designed to be so full of energy and not wasting it through our own ego thought processes and then wondering why we're not in flow when we're thinking about last year. Last year is not flow. The universe is now. And so if our center of gravity, in my little theory that I'm making up right now, was exactly how we are, and I talked about in a previous video how being in the manic state is sort of like being in your adult child state that you would be in, the energy, if you would have never been moved from the natural trajectory of your growth, as your natural growth as yourself. Now the ego things happen, blocks your energy, blocks your energy, blocks your energy, blocks your energy. So something happens, the ego structure sort of falls apart and you spring into mania, like, and you're like, whoa, and there's all this energy because the energy is not being wasted, and all those things that we're conditioned into doing internally that waste all our energy. And when the manic consciousness energy comes in, we're not wasting the energy in that way, so it feels super energetic. But to me, that's actually our natural state. And same with this whole center of gravity thing. As different things happen throughout life, education, sitting in a desk, not being allowed to be who you are, your family saying you should be this in life when you feel you're called to do this, and you're like operating at not really as high of a level as you were designed to be as your own unique self, maximizing the complexity of the universe, which is mathematically supposed to happen, but we defy the mathematics of the universe by putting all these false constructs on a person, so they're tense, they're thinking, they're deciding. If you're just you, what is there to decide about? Like, oh, should I be me or should I be me? You're just happening to be yourself. So I feel manic consciousness is actually the flow of the universe. It's a correction. It's a universal correction mechanism. It shows us how we are naturally. And that's the thing they talk about too. They talk about, oh, we're stronger in flow, we're more coordinated, we're more this, we're more that. In mania, I'm stronger, I'm taller, I'm more flexible, I'm more agile, all of those things. And it's just a click. It's not, oh, I have to practice. So it's a natural state that we have within ourselves, and it's more natural than what we think of as our daily life as natural, because those are conditioned habits and programs. We've just been programmed like computers, and we're more like reflex reaction mechanisms than actually seeing and living in the moment. So another thing with the center of gravity, this is something I made up today, and it goes along with my thought before about how the manic state is like our adult child version of ourselves, as if it had never been contorted or adjusted by the rules of society. Like, you should do this, you should do that, you should be this, your parents' expectations, studying like crap mostly as part of education in the formative years. And so all these things that we turn away from or that make us contract, they actually contort us. They're stored in our muscles, and over time we get hunched and we start walking lopsided, and all of a sudden we're older and we're like this and we don't even know it. And to me, what I'm saying is that is a messed up center of gravity of oneself. And it's like all the different constellations of memories and thoughts and things are actually stored in our physiology. And when the mania energy comes in, it blasts all that apart, and all of a sudden a person's like, I'm taller, I'm an inch taller, because I'm no longer holding myself and contracting my muscles and compressing the discs in my spine, which messes up the energy signals going up through the spinal column and the whole body energy field. And our center of gravity is different in the field of gravity. So if our center of gravity is all tense and contorted in the field of gravity, to me, right there, that if you compare the analogy of how a person who has perfected their physiology and their their whole structure to effortlessly ride a 100-foot wave. Now, think about daily life as like a 1,000,000-foot wave. Like, this is our actual life. Now, why aren't we riding that wave in flow? To me, a person could be in flow kind of all the time. For one, society's not structured for that. For two, I don't think our bodies are structured for that. So if they're using like neurophysiology, neuroelectricity, neuroanatomy, and then, the structure of the body and the force of gravity on the body as sort of like, well, this is going to get a person in flow, we're always in the field of gravity. And we have a center of gravity. And if we're not in our bodies the way they're actually designed to be, there's books on this, and I have some because I did some sessions of Rolfing, which is a structural integration process, and it's like a 10 sessions of treatment that actually, sort of unlock your body so you can move again. And I remember I went for one session because I was like, I don't want to commit to 10 sessions. I just do like a general one session. And I could reach behind my arm like this and like grab this way, but I couldn't do it this way at all. Like, I couldn't even get close to touching. It was probably like this far away. So I said, fix my shoulder or fix whatever's going on here. And after that one session, I can't do it quite as well, but I can touch. And before, I couldn't even get close. So I was like, okay, I'm going to do the 10 sessions. And I think it was really important, and I'll probably, like, 10 sessions are supposed to be good enough for life, but I'll probably go in for a tune-up at some point. But again, that's sort of like correcting my center of gravity. It's correcting a lot more than just that. But what I'm trying to illustrate here is the way that they're really curious about how people in extreme sports, basically, that accentuate the field of gravity or accentuate the body's experience of the field of gravity, get people in flow. And I'm trying to compare that to how in daily life, if we're lumped over sacks of shit, it's going to be a lot harder to get in flow because our center of gravity within the field of gravity is not the way it was designed to be. And you can look at, say, indigenous tribes in the world where things haven't really been altered as much, those different, I'm not sure about cultures very well, but they all have the same body shape because they're all adapted perfectly to hunting and gathering and their tribal activities, and they're communal, so they share everything and they don't take more than they need, and they all have these beautiful bodies that are perfectly adapted to the way they live. And now our bodies are adapted to our numbed out, junk food eating, TV watching, pleasure seeking, pain avoiding, as Jamie Wheel talks about, and that's not a secret. We're perfectly adapted to that. And then from that sack of shit point of view, we say, why can't I get in flow? And you can still get in flow as a sack of shit, but it's just more difficult. And what I'm trying to illustrate, I don't think it's necessary to have like a perfect center of gravity per se. I'm just curious if that would help. Like, I've also taken a course called Body Awakening Method, and the lady who taught the course, she taught this like exercise that you do on a chair to strengthen your psoas muscle. And she also talks about how you're supposed to walk and how you're supposed to keep your feet straight when you're standing. Not like this, and not like walking like this or like this. People think this is normal. And I actually went to her talk probably like 6 or 7 years ago. And it was like an introductory talk, and she told me about the feet straight thing, and she told everyone. And I actually walked like, this one was like this and this one was like this, and I'd walk like this and then kind of like drag this foot. And ever since that talk, I was like, wow, I'm going to correct that. I'm going to walk with my feet straight. And it didn't take long, and then I started to walk with my feet straight, and she explained how if you're not walking properly, that's putting pressure on your knees, and then that's putting pressure on your hips, and then all of a sudden you're 45 and you need a hip replacement and you're wondering why. Well, we're not utilizing our bodies the way they're actually designed to be. And she taught other tips too. So between the body awakening method, the psoas exercise, and also the Rolfing, I've done a fair share of, and being consciously aware of my posture, I've done a fair share of like structural integration. And so for me, it's not just about putting somebody in some kind of gyrating machine to see if they can get in a flow state. Like, what we could put everybody in a gyrating machine right now, and what good is that going to do? You can't really get anything done during that experience. You know, you might, to me, it's more, if you're doing that, it's more like, oh, I had a flow experience, and then you add that to your little memory of thoughts for your ego mind to think of and dwell upon. Part of the flow thing is not to dwell upon it. It's not really an experience. It's, you know, Krishnamurti talks about how it's not an experience because the experiencer is the ego. And if the experiencer is there, abstracting, then it's not that. And if it's not, so as soon as the experiencer comes back in and starts thinking about that just happened, you now made that flow a part of the system of thought as sort of, oh, I want that again, which is pleasure and desire, which actually gets in the way of it happening again. So it's more, it happens and like move on. And that happens with people in mania too. They're like, oh, that was so wonderful and amazing, and so it's such a great feeling. But it's not really about personal pleasure until we make it about that in retrospect, which is thinking about it. And I think that's another secret of this flow thing too, that they may or may not be aware of, is that flow is not personal. It's a state where the ego is absent. So that means none of the ego's shenanigans can really be accomplished while in that state. It's that much. Maybe some could. But ego shenanigans stuff is for personal gain. And that flow state is sort of being one with the universe, where there's no such thing as personal gain. So the people in those extreme athletes, they get away with it because they're kind of like, okay, I'm going to sort of check out of society and do my own thing. I'm outside of society, which society blocks flow for sure. And I'm just going to do my own thing, which it's personally wonderful to be in that flow, but it's not really going to do any harm to anybody, right? So they can kind of just mind their own business, right? Now, if a person wants to use flow for their own personal gain or some kind of evil, the thing is that evil is thought. Evil is the ego. And now the evil ego wants to get into flow, which is a negation of the ego. So in my mind, one of the ways to get into flow, if you want to think about how to, is to move towards what it is that you would like to do or participate with that has nothing to do with your own personal gain, because that state is not a state of personal gain. And I feel like if a person has that state and uses it for personal gain in the flow, and then turns it into like this memory of like, oh, that was good, I need to get that flow again and to get that personal gain, because maybe the first time they used it for personal gain, it's going to block it from ever happening again, because it's actually a gift from the universe to be one with the universe. It's not really a gift, it's our natural state. And it's not our natural state to be these egos competing with each other, killing each other, comparing with each other, and all these things that are just totally acceptable in society, which is not flow. And then, anyways, yeah. And that happens in mania, where people feel like, oh, this is all about me. And it's hard to not get to that place, because it feels like everything is one. Everything's the same. Everything's one process. There is no separation. So at some point, if the ego kind of sneaks in a bit, it thinks, well, that means it's all about me. But it's just this really wonderful oneness experience. And it's not an experience, because oneness is the way it is. It's our ego mind that thinks it's different, that blocks that. It interprets things. It turns things into concepts and abstractions. The feeling of hunger is not an abstraction. I don't have to think I am hungry to know that I'm hungry. But since we always think I'm hungry when we're hungry, we think we have to think I'm hungry to know that we're hungry and to actually go get some food. But it's not really that way. And it's the same with any other thought. And it could be seen as really obvious in that we happen to get a lot of things done, even though we're thinking about something else. So just in that, it kind of proves that we don't need to think about stuff in order to do it. Because when we're doing something, we're usually thinking about something else that has nothing to do with it. So it's just a matter of seeing, well, this has nothing to do with anything that I'm doing. And maybe it'll just go away. And then, lo and behold, we're in flow. Most of the time. So that's the comparison of the center of gravity thought that I have about our poor, contorted bodies. And I recently came across this thing called trauma release experience, or something. I can't remember. TRE. And I saw it before, but I never really looked into it. And so today I actually tried it for the first time. And this really weird thing, if you Google it and you see the videos, people start kind of shaking and stuff. And I was laying there shaking, and I listened to an interview by Mary Shriver. She talked about how trauma is a memory problem, and how this TRE sort of releases it from our hippocampus. And I did read from Dr. Daniel Siegel that during traumatic experiences, our hippocampus shuts down and we don't really encode the memories of what's happening properly. And so those memories are sort of scattered in the brain, and they can be recalled, and they lack euphoric sensation, which means they lack the feeling that they're coming from the past. So then we feel like they're happening now. And so when Mary Shriver said trauma is a memory problem, it made me realize that's kind of what Dr. Daniel Siegel is saying. And I did talk about in another video my own little theory about how if the hippocampus is shut down and the brain's not sort of putting the memories where they're supposed to go, well, where does that energy go? And I think it's still encoded in the heart, and the heart has memory too. We already know that from people with heart transplants. I think some of it gets encoded in the heart, and the heart's more about like electromagnetism and patterns being stored. And I think maybe if it's blocked from this hippocampus putting it in the brain properly, it just gets stored throughout our entire body. You know, like if we're being traumatized and maybe we're not even aware, we don't even, like, say we're unconscious or something, our heart is still beating, and it's beating with fear, and that is electromagnetism, and it's repatterning every cell in our entire body with that energy. And so I think that this trauma release something, whatever it's called, is supposed to release it from the body. And I'll probably be experimenting with trying it a few more times, because everybody has some stuff stored. And what I'm thinking too is that releasing it from my body is releasing it from the cells and the muscles and everything, which is going to do that whole changing my center of gravity to, me carrying myself as I'm meant to be carried, which means my center of gravity and my body and my pattern is moving through the pattern of the entire reality, the entire universe, the quantum hologram. It's moving through as it was meant to, not as things happened and thoughts and memories got stored in me and contorted my structure. So I find that really interesting about that. And so I've tried Rolfing, I've tried the body awakening method stuff. Both are awesome. And now I'm going to be trying this trauma release exercise thing. And that's the thing that Stephen Kotler talked about was, and Jamie Wheel as well, is that we go into things through like the psychology and stuff and try and like talk it out and everything. And they say that the precognition stuff is much more powerful. So talk therapy is like cognitive stuff. The precognition stuff they think is more powerful. And so they're saying flow is like a precognitive state. And to me that just means stuff is happening without thought going on, and abstracting and conceptualizing about it is just really just happening. And so they're saying by going through like the portal of like the body, sort of, a lot more can be accomplished. And this TRE seems to be that too. And actually the lady Mary Shriver talked about that. She said you can't really talk it out. It's stored in the body, and so that's how it's apparently valuable. So I bought the TRE app, and I'm going to be giving it a try. And so in the morning I do something I learned from Body Awakening Method called bedroom yoga. And then I do a little exercise for my psoas muscle. And lately I've been jumping on my trampoline, my mini trampoline, and that gets the lymphatic system moving as well. That is naturally like a body moving in gravity experience, and probably there's a little bit of extra G force when I'm bouncing on the trampoline. And now I'll be doing this TRE thing and seeing how that goes in terms of all this structural integration stuff. And for me, it's actually, I feel like I can go into that other state, that manic state. I've gone into it a few times over the last 5 years. And I feel like, say, like my ego structures, and maybe there's transient hypofrontality in mania, and then I loosen up and I lighten up and my center of gravity changes. Well, in my mind, if I can, and then when I come back to regular consciousness, I'm a little bit more contorted and everything. So if I, on a daily basis, am sort of exercising my center of gravity in a way, and maybe moving it slightly towards how it would be in mania, I feel that would be part of embodying one's mania, because one can get to the point where one's body is maybe close to that bodily expression in the flow state. So they say, we get stronger, we get more agile and all these things in the flow state. Well, we can get ourselves to the point where we are kind of that way. And a lot of people go to the gym and they do their like bicep curls and their sit-ups and everything. And something I learned in Rolfing and as well in Body Awakening Method is a lot of what we do at the gym actually compresses and crushes our skeleton. So if we're doing all these ab crunches, we're actually compressing the discs of the spine, because we're making this really tight. We're doing all these things to kind of make us like this. And some people still look wonderfully beautiful and all muscular and stuff, but there's certain muscles we don't strengthen, it's actually more important to be stronger beside the rib cage, like from the bottom of the ribs to the top of the hips on the sides, to actually hold up our rib cage. We're actually supposed to hold ourselves up with that sort of cummerbund type muscle. Now, if we have really tight abs, we're actually doing the opposite and we're contracting ourselves. Whereas if we have strong side muscles, we can hold ourselves up. And if we're not holding ourselves up with those muscles and our head slightly forward, we're actually slowly going to be compressing. We're going to be, getting hunched over, basically. But that doesn't need to happen if we're holding ourselves up with those muscles, standing with our feet straight, blah, blah, blah. Find the Lightworkers Institute if you want to know more about that, or read books on Rolfing. It's very interesting. So to go with my little theory about one's perfect center of gravity, of their body actually being in alignment with gravity, so the body's weight is actually carried by the joints and the skeleton and not the muscles. Because if our body weight is supported by our muscles, then we're actually tensing up, and that would change our structure and our center of gravity. And part of my little theory with this is if I was to say one of the ways to get into flow, it would be make sure you're in like 100% perfect alignment to be in flow all the time in daily life. And even if you think about it too, like imagine you're your perfect aligned self, completely comfortable in your structure. The way you carry yourself throughout life is going to be a lot different. The pattern that's recognized to yourself and others as you is going to be more elegant or more expressive, happier, and that is going to change your whole energy field. And it's also going to change how people respond to you. It's going to change the whole trajectory of your life. And now if you are in that pattern where you're very comfortable and within your own skin, you would naturally think that you would be in a little bit more flow. Like you wouldn't be thinking, I'm so this and I'm so that, if you're just naturally the structure of who you're meant to be. And to go with that, I had this other little thought and theory that our negative thinking patterns, it's actually electromagnetism in our brain. It changes our brain. It changes our neuroplasticity. It changes everything. It actually gets us stuck in this prefrontal cortex and gets in the way of this transient hypofrontality. In my mind, it doesn't have to be transient hypofrontality. It should be actually transient frontality. We should only have that bit of our brain turned on when we actually need it. And this completely makes sense. We're wondering, how can we get 5 minutes of flow, or how can we get an hour of flow? My question is, why aren't we in flow all the time and in this little thinking, petty little ego consciousness just when that needs to turn on for convenience? So I actually think that these thoughts and everything contribute to contorting the structure, as well as changing one's energy field. And the energy field is the pattern, it's the hologram of who we are, it's our information. And I talked about the adjacent light body. Now, we're not going to be our adjacent light body version of ourselves if we're this material structure, thinking, inner critic, judging, choosing version of ourselves. And we've been conditioned to be that way, unfortunately, so we're not actually free. We're prisoners of our own minds. And it's kind of sad. But I actually think that if one has this prefrontal cortex stuff going on, that changes our energy field in a way that negates flow. It can't happen. That actually has to turn off, which is like, the fuzz screen on a TV. Like if we always had that playing in our minds and our heads, that's kind of what the ego consciousness is. It's all this noise. And it's like they think, oh, we turn off the prefrontal cortex, what's going to happen? It's like, oh, turns out we're in flow. How is that possible? Well, because the ego is just a bunch of noise. it's not really saying anything that's actually real or true. It's like a big hallucination. If it's saying something that's not happening right in this moment or have anything to do with this moment, then it's a hallucination. And that's so-called normal. And then people that go into mania decouple from that and then are in extreme ecstasy, feel free, often run naked down the street because they feel like they've just been reborn. And in a society that's not designed for someone to be that way, it's very difficult for one to stay in that state. And then a lot of people get really mad and stuff at some point, but it's almost like having to die to come back to this egocentric world. And I really feel that the flow state and the manic state and that extra energy, like we think we need to think to do stuff, but it actually gets in the way of the energy that we naturally have. We didn't have to think to do stuff when we were young, children. And again, that world centricity, and that's the thing in mania, is a lot of us, we feel very world centric for a portion of it. And maybe that's the difference, because in a flow state, a person is kind of like doing their own thing for their own self a little bit. Like, I'm in flow and I'm getting lots of work done for me. Whereas in mania, I actually think it's a step beyond. There's this extra energy, and a person really wants to share and help the world. And that's what happens when the ego consciousness is completely blown away, because we realize it's all one, and we're just wanting to help the world. Not because we're thinking, we want to help the world. It's just we see that's the only thing to do. There's nothing else to do. And so I feel if a person is to really flow, it's a matter of finding one's cause. And that could almost be, when I was talking about how the surfer has like a body perfectly adapted for riding that wave, and they've taken hours and hours and hours to do that. Well, how are we perfectly adapted without even spending a second to think about it? And what would we do? What would we do if there was no time? There's no time left. It's only right now. That's it. And Krishnamurti talks about psychological time, and that's basically the ego thinking about itself and how it's not real. And as soon as the ego thinks about itself, it creates psychological time, which prevents a person from being in the now, which blocks flow. So thinking about oneself is actually dis-ease. We're not at ease with ourselves, so we're thinking about ourself, which the thinking about the self, the thinking is the self. It's one thing, and it's no amount of thinking with that self is going to allow a person to get into flow. And it's interesting because that flow dojo is kind of designed to get a person to be so scared, because like they're sort of doing things with their body that would get them killed if they weren't in a safe contraption. Now, why do we need to be scared to the point of shitting our pants in order to get our ego mind to turn off? If we really saw that the ego mind itself is fear, it actually creates all of this crap. It's like as dangerous as jumping out of a plane, that thinking about oneself, which is an illusion. There's no self there. There's just this happening stuff. You can't separate each thing that happens, each gesture, from that thing that is happening. There's no separate thing. If I move my hand, I don't have to think, move my hand in order for that to happen. But since there's something going on here, we think it actually has some kind of correlation. But it has no correlation whatsoever, and it's actually blocking the flow. And being in this scared ego self-reflexive thinking state is creating all that fear, which is creating all this toxic neurochemicals and biochemicals in the body, which is actually poisoning us. So this process is actually killing us. It's actually as dangerous as like a poisonous snake biting us 24/7, but we don't see that. So it's more like a leech where we don't actually feel like it's on our skin. It numbs us out. It dulls us out. We don't actually see anything that's happening. We only see what our mind is saying. How can we flow if we only see what our mind is saying, which is something that happened 10 years ago? That's not happening now. It's not now. So to me, it's not really this like big mystery. I'm curious about, well, I've thought about it before. It's like, how would I design my life as a maniac? Because the thing is that it's difficult to actually be that way. And I feel like at this point now, I'm more aware when that sort of extra manic energy comes in, and I kind of like have to block it. So instead of trying to get in flow, I actually need to block flow. I actually need to be like, okay, I'm just gonna be calm for a while and go to sleep, because all this extra energy is coming and be like, whoa, like I'm riding the wave of the universe and daily life. What could be better? I don't need to go on a freaking wave. This is the most beautiful thing ever. What else could be more beautiful? There's like cute little insects and spiders outside, and there's flowers, and there's other people, and I don't need a wave. The fact we need a wave or to drop out of a plane to see it is absolutely ridiculous.